This week, we start a new Bible study series here at Community of Christ called When God Breaks the Rules. And I know at first blush, that might sound like the title's all wrong. We maybe need to start with, hold on, I thought God's the one who gives rules. Literal like commandments chiseled in stone by the finger of God. Isn't that God the giver of rules? And yeah, fair enough. Sure, there are times where God gives rules or instructs us in how we're supposed to live. But the story isn't complete unless we also look at times when God does the opposite and takes rules or assumptions that we bring, and God has a way of turning them upside down, blowing them apart, or bending and even breaking them. Case in point, this first session, as we take a look at how God overturns a societal rule about what birth order matters in our families. So here's the first thing that's worth saying out loud. Sometimes we human beings have a way of taking a look at how the world seems to work most of the time and just assume because that's the way things are, that must be the way God wants them to be. We have a way of taking a look at the way the world looks like it works and saying this must be God's intention and fashioning it into a rule. Or we take the cultural norms of a given time and think this must be what God wants because most of the people around me think this is how things are. A classic example is what's sometimes called the law or the rule of primogeniture. In other words, the idea that whoever is firstborn is most important. You find this often a lot in many cultures throughout history, that the firstborns are the most important, and any children who come along after that get small shares of inheritance, lesser title, less significance, because they don't need it to carry on the family name. They're seen as spares, right, as an extra, but the firstborn is the one who matters. That sort of stands in the background, as it turns out, of a lot of the stories early on in the biblical story. For example, in the book of Genesis, we find a lot of family stories, especially once we get into the family story of Abraham and Sarah, where the default assumption is that firstborn children are most important and anybody else who comes along is second. And that sort of stands as this default assumption. Nobody has to say it out loud that firstborns are more important. It was just the assumed practice of the day. It was sort of like an unspoken rule, sort of what they call common law, right? The kind of things that didn't need to be written down. Everybody just knows that's how the world works. Sometimes those kinds of rules are the worst. It turns out the things everybody knows are how things are might turn out to be things that deal death rather than give life. So anyway, as we finally encounter Abraham and Sarah, this couple in Genesis 12 who are called by God to pick up their lives and move and leave their family behind and go to a new land that God will show them. And God promises, even though they have no children, I will give you descendants. In fact, I'll give you so many descendants that they will fill the world like the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the shore. And I will bless all nations of the earth through your descendants. Okay. Abraham and Sarah go, and as they wait and wait for children, at some point, they decide to take matters into their own hands, deciding that God's taken too long, and Abraham ends up treating Sarah's servant, handmaid, and slave girl, Hagar, as a concubine, and has a child with her, Ishmael. And so technically Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn son. He should be the most important. And then God says, hold on, I'm not done keeping my promise. And eventually a son is born to Abraham and Sarah, Isaac. And he turns out to be the one, at least as the book of Genesis tells it, through whom God continues the family line and the promise. In other words, God upends the usual order. Ishmael is the firstborn, he should be the one that is blessed, and yet God reserves the right to go, nope, I'm going to pick the secondborn. It'll be Isaac, through whom I continue my family line. And at that point, at the moment we think, well, I guess then we can forget Ishmael, he's not important, God reserves the right to break a rule again and to say, even though I'm going to continue blessing Isaac family line, I haven't forgotten Ishmael. I'll bless him and make a great nation of him as well. If you think that's just a weird one-off or an exception, when Isaac comes of age and now he's going to be a father, his wife, Rebekah, is carrying twins, and they named them Esau and Jacob. You might know this story. Esau is born the first of the two, even though it's just by a few minutes. But God ends up choosing to continue to pass the blessing along through the second-born, through Jacob, even though everybody knows the rule that the firstborn is most important. The firstborn gets the blessing and the title and the land. Here's God upending the usual order of things. The pattern continues on throughout those stories of those patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel, where even though God knows the cultural assumption, the unspoken rule is firstborns are most important, everybody else is unimportant, God continues almost deliberately, almost by sheer choice and divine delight, in overturning those expectations, taking the secondborns or the smaller or the younger and lifting them up above the supposed most important big deal firstborns. It's the beginning of a pattern that will happen throughout the scriptures, and it happens at other important key moments. King David, who is remembered, at least in Israel's memory, as the best of Israel's kings, even though it's really more he was the least worst compared to a bunch of real duds. But David, when he's set apart to be king, he's not the oldest or the tallest or the greatest. He's the runt of the family. He's the youngest kid in the family, youngest of all of his brothers, 8 other brothers, and he's seen as not even important enough to come to the big gala where the new king is going to be anointed. And yet, God sets him apart. It's again, God taking the usual expected order, the unspoken rule of the day that firstborns are most important, and turning it upside down. God has a way throughout the scriptures of doing that, such that when Jesus comes along and says, in God's reign, the first are last and the last are first, in a sense, it shouldn't come as a shock. This is what God has been doing all along, that when we human beings come along and decree rules about who's most important and who's top of the heap and who's at the bottom of the heap, even down to birth order, God has a way of turning those tables and saying, watch how I do something, lifting up the ones that you said were unimportant and taking the arrogant and overinflated people at the top down a few pegs. In other words, part of the core of God's identity seems to be that kind of reversal, choosing the people who've been overlooked and lifting up those who've been treated like they don't matter. From the beginning of the Bible, as a thread that runs through the whole story, God breaks that rule. Even when it's our rule, even when it's our cultural norms and assumptions, we human beings have a way of treating it like it's an unbreakable law of the universe, like gravity, that the firstborns are most important, that the people who are first are the ones on the top. And God has a way of taking those expectations and turning them upside down. We're going to explore stories like that in this first session this week on Thursday as a beginning to take a look at what it means that God is willing to take the rules that we sometimes foist upon each other or on the world, and that God is willing to break those rules and turn them upside down for God's good purposes. This will be our first step in a 10-part series, and we're going to take a look at all sorts of other ways that God takes rules, whether they're ours or religious rules or rules we don't know where they've come from, or even ones that people think came from God in the first place, and that God is willing to set them aside for the sake of loving people, for the sake of bringing about God's good purposes. So join us throughout all these weeks. If you can catch us in person around the table, that's going to be 1 o'clock on Thursdays here at Community of Christ. There will always be a place for you at the table. Or if you can't join us in person, catch up with these video summaries we'll be putting up week by week. We hope we'll see you along the way to explore when God breaks the rules. See you then.